Mr. Hill, what has television given you?
Well, nervous dyspepsia, indigestion, heartburn, all sorts of things like that, you know.
For over 3 decades, one man made the entire world laugh. His rubber face, his perfect timing, his ability to become anyone from a bumbling policeman to a pompous aristocrat. Benny Hill was, by almost every measure, the most watched comedian on the planet. At the peak of his fame, more than 21 million British viewers tuned in every single week. His show aired in over 140 countries. He was genuinely a global phenomenon. And then, almost overnight, it was gone. No grand farewell. No final curtain call. Just a phone call. A quiet decision made in a boardroom at Thames Television. And 30 years of comedy brought to an unceremonious end. The year was 1989. And the show that had once dominated television screens across the world was canceled, and it never came back during Benny Hill's lifetime. So what actually happened? What brought one of television's most beloved programs crashing down after decades of success? The answer involves changing times, a very public attack from a fellow comedian, shifting attitudes inside the television industry, and one style of humor that an entire generation of critics decided they had finally had enough of. This is the real story of how the Benny Hill Show went off the air for good, and why it happened the way it did. To understand the fall, you first need to appreciate just how extraordinary the rise was. Alfred Hawthorne Hill was born in Southampton, England, in 1924, and from the very beginning, entertainment was in his blood. His grandfather had been a circus clown, and though his father ran a surgical appliance shop, the spirit of performance clearly passed down through the generations. Young Alfred worked a string of ordinary jobs at Woolworths, as a milkman, as a truck driver, even as a drummer, before finally finding his way into show business as an assistant stage manager with a touring revue. He adopted the stage name Benny as a tribute to his hero, the American comedian Jack Benny, whose impeccable timing and deadpan delivery he deeply admired. After serving in the British Army during World War II, where he trained as a mechanic, drove trucks, operated searchlights, and eventually transferred to the Combined Services Entertainment Division performing for troops, he came home with sharper instincts, better timing, and a burning desire to make people laugh professionally. His radio debut came in 1947, and by 1950, he had made his first television appearance. The medium suited him perfectly. Television gave him room that radio never could, room for physical comedy, for visual gags, for the kind of rubber-faced, larger-than-life character work that would become his trademark. When the Benny Hill Show premiered on the BBC on January 15, 1955, it was immediately clear that something special was happening. The show blended live sketches with pre-recorded segments in a style borrowed from the great British music hall tradition, and Hill's energy, his slapstick, his double entendres, his gift for parody and impression, connected with audiences in a way that felt both familiar and completely original. The show evolved considerably over the years. When it moved from the BBC to Thames Television in 1969, it entered what many would consider its golden era. Rather than weekly episodes, the format shifted to longer, one-hour specials that gave Hill the creative space to build more elaborate sketches, more complex musical numbers, and more ambitious productions overall. The results were spectacular. Viewer numbers climbed to over 21 million in 1971. The show was eventually broadcast in more than 140 countries, making Benny Hill one of the few British entertainers who could genuinely claim to be famous on every inhabited continent. A central part of what made the show so distinctive was its ensemble. Hill worked alongside a loyal and talented group of performers over the years. Jackie Wright, the small bald-headed actor who bore the brunt of Hill's notorious head-slapping routines with perfect stoic timing. Henry McGee, who brought a wonderfully pompous straight-man quality to countless sketches. Bob Todd, whose physical comedy complemented Hill's own beautifully. And then, in the 1980s, came Hill's Angels, a troupe of dancers and performers who added choreography, glamour, and a heightened physicality to the show's already lively format. The runoff chase sequence, which typically closed each episode, became one of the most iconic recurring gags in British television history. Filmed using a technique called undercranking, shooting at a slower frame rate and playing back at normal speed to create a sped-up, frenetic effect. These madcap chases featured Hill and his cast racing across various settings in a burst of escalating absurdity. The whole thing was set to a honking, joyful saxophone tune called Yakety Sax by Boots Randolph, a piece of music that became so completely associated with Hill's brand of comedy that it is still commonly known simply as the Benny Hill theme. In 2015, it was voted the #1 television theme tune in a special ITV poll, a remarkable testament to how deeply it embedded itself in popular culture. For a long time, none of this was remotely controversial. The humor was broad, the innuendo was cheerful, the slapstick was harmless, and audiences loved it. Hill was recognized with a BAFTA Award for Best Writer in 1972, and the Thames television version of the show received Emmy Award nominations in both 1980 and 1981 for Outstanding Variety. In 1984, he received the prestigious Rose d'Or Award, cementing his status as a pioneering figure in international television comedy. By any objective measure, Benny Hill was at the absolute summit of his profession. But the 1980s were a decade of change, and not all of that change was working in Hill's favor. British comedy was shifting. A new generation of performers and writers had emerged, people who called themselves alternative comedians, who were sharp, politically aware, and deeply skeptical of the kind of humor that had dominated British television screens since the 1950s, where the old guard had leaned on slapstick, sexual innuendo, and recurring stock characters. The alternative comedy scene prized social awareness, self-awareness, and a willingness to challenge the assumptions baked into mainstream entertainment. Benny Hill, with his sped-up chase sequences featuring scantily clad women, his cheerfully leering characters, and his reliance on physical comedy built around the female form, became a particular target. Critics argued that his humor was not simply old-fashioned. They argued it was actively harmful, that it presented women as objects of ridicule and pursuit rather than as full human beings, that it normalized a particular male gaze that had no place on public television in a society that was, slowly and sometimes painfully, reckoning with questions of gender and equality. The most vocal and prominent of these critics was Ben Elton, a comedian and writer who had become one of the defining voices of the alternative comedy movement. In January 1987, Elton made headlines when he gave an interview to Q magazine in which he accused the Benny Hill show of contributing to a culture in which women felt unsafe. He had also aired similar views on the television program Saturday Live. His argument was pointed and serious, that the repeated visual joke of women being chased, ogled, and objectified, dressed up as harmless fun, sent real messages to real audiences about how women could and should be treated. The reaction was immediate and divided. Supporters of Hill and his show thought Elton's criticism was wildly exaggerated. Writers and publications, including The Independent, suggested that blaming a comedy program for social problems was not only unfair, but bordered on absurd. One particularly memorable comparison suggested that holding Hill responsible for attitudes toward women was as logical as blaming concert pianists for elephant poaching. GQ magazine was similarly dismissive, arguing that Elton's position was pompous and overwrought. But others felt differently. The debate Elton sparked resonated with a growing number of people who had begun to feel uncomfortable watching the show, not because they were humorless, but because the cultural context in which they were watching had changed. What had once seemed like innocent, cheeky fun looked different through the lens of 1980s feminist discourse and the ongoing public conversation about how women were represented in media. The Broadcasting Standards Council, a regulatory body, weighed in too, with a spokesman noting publicly that what had once been considered acceptable television entertainment was increasingly being viewed as outdated and offensive. It is worth noting, in fairness, that Elton himself later showed he could take the joke. In the comedy series Harry Enfield and Chums, a sketch appeared in which Elton was parodied as a character called Benny Elton, a figure so committed to political correctness that he became a comedic figure in his own right, chased by angry women to the strains of Yakety Sax. It was a self-deprecating moment that suggested the whole debate had developed a certain absurdist quality of its own. But comedy and cultural criticism were only part of the picture. Inside Thames Television, the numbers were telling their own story. Viewership for the Benny Hill show had been declining. The audience that had once numbered over 21 million was shrinking. British television was changing too. More channels, more competition, more variety, and an audience whose tastes were evolving in new directions. The show had also become expensive to produce. Each episode reportedly cost in the region of £450,000, a substantial sum that was becoming harder and harder to justify as advertising revenues tracked the declining audience figures. In late May 1989, Thames Television made its decision. The Benny Hill Show was canceled after 21 years and a relationship that had reportedly earned Thames something in the region of £26 million, largely thanks to the show's enormous success in the United States, where it had been widely syndicated. The partnership came to an end. Benny Hill was, by all accounts, deeply hurt. He had not seen it coming in the way that perhaps he should have. The show had been his life's work, the vehicle through which he had expressed everything he knew about comedy, character, timing, and performance. To have it taken away, without a farewell episode, without a proper send-off, was a wound that never fully healed. What followed was a quieter chapter. In 1991, Hill began work on a new project called Benny Hill's World Tour, which was designed to take his comedy to the international audiences who had always loved him so enthusiastically. The concept was simple and appealing. Hill would perform his sketches in various locations around the world where his original show had been popular. But the project ran into difficulties, and only one special was completed, Greetings from New York, which reunited him with familiar faces, including Henry McGee, Bob Todd, and Sue Upton. The special was later released on DVD and described as Benny Hill's final television appearance. In February 1992, Thames Television responded to persistent requests from viewers by re-airing re-edited versions of classic episodes from the show's long run. The decision demonstrated that even 3 years after its cancellation, there remained a genuine appetite for Hill's comedy among British audiences. But Hill himself was not in good health. He suffered a mild heart attack on February 24, 1992. Doctors advised him to undergo heart bypass surgery, but he refused. He was subsequently diagnosed with kidney failure and declined dialysis treatment as well. He continued to live alone in his flat in Teddington, quietly and without fuss, in the manner that had always characterized his private life. On the morning of April 20, 1992, Benny Hill passed away peacefully at the age of 68, sitting in his armchair watching television. His body was not discovered until 2 days later, after several unanswered phone calls prompted concern. The official cause of death was coronary thrombosis. In a detail that carries a particular poignancy, a new contract from Central Independent Television reportedly arrived at his flat on the same day he died. He was laid to rest at Hollybrook Cemetery in Southampton, near where he had been born almost 7 decades earlier. His estate, valued at over £7.5 million, was left primarily to his parents in a will written 30 years before his death. But since both had predeceased him, his fortune passed instead to his 7 nieces and nephews. The story of the Benny Hill Show's cancellation is not a simple story with a single villain or a single cause. It was the product of many forces converging at once: changing cultural attitudes, a shift in the economics of television production, declining audience numbers, the fierce and very public criticisms of the alternative comedy movement, and a television industry that was itself evolving rapidly and unsentimental about leaving its past behind. Benny Hill was, in many respects, a product of a particular time. He had grown up on music hall comedy and wartime entertainment. His sensibility was formed by an era in which broad, physical, cheerfully body humor was not only acceptable but celebrated. He never fully understood, or perhaps never fully accepted, that the world had moved on from the assumptions that underpinned so much of what he did. And yet the dismissal of his work as simply sexist or outdated also misses something important. His physical comedy was genuinely brilliant. His ability to embody dozens of different characters, pompous, bumbling, vain, naive, demonstrated a range that few comedians of any era could match. His writing, which earned him a BAFTA, was sharp and inventive, and the warmth that audiences around the world felt for him was real, not manufactured, not cynical, but a genuine human connection forged through decades of shared laughter. In November 2021, That's TV announced that The Benny Hill Show would return to nationwide British television for the first time in nearly 20 years, as part of their Christmas schedule. New generations of viewers discovered what their parents and grandparents had found so irresistible. The laughter was still there. The timing was still impeccable. And yakety sax still made people smile before they even knew why. The scene that took the Benny Hill show off the air was not one single moment caught on camera. It was a longer, slower scene, played out across years, in boardrooms and magazine interviews and cultural conversations and changing audience habits. But the man at the center of it all, the one who made 21 million people laugh every single week at his absolute peak, left behind something that no boardroom decision could ever fully extinguish. The laughter, in the end, outlasted everything else.